Beneath the cold, pale light of a crescent moon, Blaise stood at the threshold of the tomb of the Firstborn. His armor, once gleaming, now bore the scars of countless battles. His eyes, once burning with the fire of vengeance, had dulled, haunted by the weight of his past failures. The tomb loomed before him, a towering structure of ancient stone, its entrance carved with symbols older than the oldest mortal empires. The wind whispered through the desolate landscape, carrying with it the scent of decay. This place was not merely a burial site, it was a prison for the cursed. Legends spoke of the first vampire king, entombed here, guarded by his undying offspring. Blaise had heard the stories of how the vampire lords had once been humanity's protectors, cursed for their inability to save the world from the darkness that now enveloped it. But it wasn't the legends that brought him here, it was desperation. The centuries-old war between humans and vampires had ravaged the lands, and Blaise knew he could no longer fight it alone. His only hope now lay within these cold stone walls, in the hands of the very creatures he had sworn to destroy. As he stepped closer, the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. The entrance to the tomb beckoned, a yawning maw of shadow. Blaise's hand hovered over the hilt of his sword, but he knew steel alone would not protect him here. Inside, ancient powers far greater than anything he had faced awaited. The vampire clan that dwelled within were said to be the last remnants of the Firstborn's legacy, their fates bound to the tomb's dark magic. He had come not as a warrior, but as a supplicant, seeking an alliance with the Ancient Ones. From the shadows, two figures emerged, their forms barely visible in the dim light. Lilith, tall and regal, her raven-black hair cascading over her dark robes, and Sable, silent as death, his pale eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. They moved with an elegance that only centuries of unlife could grant. "You seek an audience with the Firstborn," Lilith's voice echoed, her tone both commanding and cold. Blaise nodded, his voice caught in his throat. It was a dangerous gamble, but he had no other choice. The fate of both his world and theirs rested on the fragile hope of redemption. "Enter then," Sable whispered, his voice like the wind rustling dead leaves. The two vampires turned and led Blaise into the tomb's depths. The air grew colder as they descended, the weight of the tomb pressing in from all sides. Carved stone corridors stretched out in every direction, each one more oppressive than the last. The scent of ancient blood hung heavy in the air, and the silence was suffocating. Blaise's heart pounded in his chest as they approached a massive door, etched with symbols of power and death. Behind it, the truth of the vampire's curse awaited. The massive door creaked open, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in the faint glow of crimson torches. The walls were adorned with grotesque murals depicting the ancient history of the vampires, their rise, their fall, and the curse that bound them to eternal night. Blaise followed Lilith and Sable into the heart of the tomb, his every step echoing in the silence. The air was thick with the weight of ancient magic, the kind that made his skin crawl and his breath shallow. His eyes flicked to the walls, where the Firstborn's face was immortalized in stone, terrifying yet regal. "You tread on sacred ground, Blaise," Lilith murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, though it seemed to reverberate through the chamber. "The Firstborn will not take kindly to outsiders, even those seeking redemption." Blaise's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword, though he knew no steel could protect him here. Sable moved silently ahead, his form a shadow among shadows. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the tomb itself were alive, watching, waiting. As they neared the inner sanctum, Blaise could feel the pull of dark magic, stronger now, clawing at the edges of his mind. He had heard stories of those who entered the tomb and never returned, their souls claimed by the Firstborn. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of whispering, low and unintelligible at first, but growing louder with each step. The voices seemed to emanate from the very walls, a cacophony of the damned. Blaise clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to turn back. This was a test, one he could not afford to fail. Suddenly the chamber opened into a grand hall, and there in the centre lay the coffin of the Firstborn, bound in chains of silver and marked with runes of power. The Vampire King's resting place was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a relic of a time when gods walked among mortals. Lilith and Sable halted before it, their gazes fixed on the coffin. "The Firstborn will speak to you now," Lilith said, her voice tinged with something akin to reverence. "But be warned, the truth you seek may cost you more than you are willing to give." Blaise stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as the chains around the coffin began to rattle. The runes glowed faintly, and the air grew thick with power. A deep voice, ancient and resonant, echoed through the hall, though the coffin remained closed. "You come seeking redemption," the Firstborn's voice rumbled. "But redemption comes only through sacrifice." Blaise's breath hitched as the weight of the words settled over him. He had come to end a war, but the price may be his soul. The coffin of the Firstborn shuddered violently, the chains rattling as the ancient Vampire King's power surged through the chamber. Blaise could feel it, a dark force older than the world itself, pressing against his soul. Lilith and Sable stood motionless, their eyes locked on the coffin, as though awaiting a judgment they had long anticipated. Blaise's hand tightened around his sword's hilt, though he knew no weapon could stand against the being within. The air grew colder, and the runes on the coffin began to glow brighter, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. "You seek redemption," the Firstborn's voice echoed, as if coming from the very walls. "But redemption is not so easily earned." Blaise stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I did not come for myself," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I came to end this war, to free both our peoples from this curse." The room trembled with the Firstborn's laughter, cold and mirthless. "End the war?" the voice asked. "The war is only a symptom. The true curse lies within us all." The runes flared, and suddenly the coffin's lid began to shift, inching open. Blaise's breath caught as the chains snapped, one by one, with an ear-splitting crack. From within the coffin, a figure began to rise, a tall, regal form wrapped in shadows. The Firstborn's eyes gleamed in the dim light, burning with an ancient and terrible hunger. His voice was a low growl, filled with centuries of sorrow and rage. "We were once protectors," he said, his gaze piercing through Blaise. "But we failed, and for our failure we were cursed to walk the night." Blaise stood frozen as the Firstborn descended from the coffin, his presence overwhelming. "You seek to break this curse?" the Vampire King asked, his voice quieter now, more contemplative. "Then know this. It cannot be broken by force of will alone. Sacrifice is required. Blood is required." Blaise swallowed hard, the weight of the words settling over him. He had expected a fight, a battle of strength and skill. But this was something far more dangerous. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The Firstborn's eyes glowed with dark wisdom. "To end the curse," he said, "one must willingly give themselves to it, become one with the night. Only then can the cycle be broken." Blaise's blood ran cold as the truth of the vampire's redemption sank in. He had not come to destroy the vampires, but to save them, and in doing so, he would have to sacrifice his humanity. The decision lay before him, as heavy as the chains that once bound the Firstborn. Would he accept his fate and break the curse, or turn away and let the war rage on? Blaise's breath came in shallow gasps as he faced the Firstborn, his mind swirling with the weight of the Vampire King's words. The notion of sacrificing his humanity to end the centuries-old war gnawed at him. He had spent his life fighting to protect his people, to destroy the creatures who preyed upon them in the night. But now he was confronted with the truth. The vampires were once protectors, like him, cursed for their failure to save humanity from a far greater evil. And now, the only way to end the curse was to become part of it. Lilith stepped forward, her eyes filled with an unspoken plea. "You must understand, Blaise," she whispered, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "We have lived with this curse for centuries, and every night we are reminded of our failure. But you have the chance to break this cycle." Sable's gaze was colder, but beneath his stoic exterior, there was a flicker of hope. Blaise turned his back to the Firstborn for a moment, staring into the darkened chamber, his thoughts waging war within him. Could he give up everything he knew, everything he was, to save not just humanity, but the vampires as well? "The choice is yours, Blaise," the Firstborn intoned, his voice softer now, though still echoing with power. "But know this, should you refuse, the war will rage on, and both our peoples will be lost to the night forever." Blaise clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. He thought of all the lives lost, all the blood spilled, and the families torn apart by the endless conflict. His own family had been destroyed by this war, leaving him alone, a broken warrior seeking redemption. Now, that redemption was within reach, but it came at a cost he wasn't sure he could bear. With a deep breath, Blaise turned to face the Firstborn once more. His decision was made. "I will do it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear swirling inside him. "I will break the curse." Lilith's expression softened, and for the first time, Blaise saw something akin to relief in her eyes. Sable nodded silently, his pale gaze unreadable. The Firstborn's eyes gleamed with approval. "Then prepare yourself," the Vampire King said, "for when the curse is lifted, there will be no going back." The Firstborn raised his hand, and dark magic filled the air, swirling around Blaise like a tempest. The runes on the coffin flared to life, and Blaise felt a searing pain in his chest as the power of the Firstborn coursed through him. His vision blurred, and the chamber around him seemed to fade into darkness. In that moment, Blaise knew. He was no longer the man he once was. He had become something else, something more. As the magic settled, the chains that had once bound the Firstborn shattered completely, and a new dawn broke over the ancient tomb. As the magic settled, Blaise collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with the force of the transformation. The air around him was still thick with the remnants of dark power, but something had shifted. The ancient curse that had bound the vampires to eternal night had been severed, its hold broken by Blaise's sacrifice. He lifted his gaze to the Firstborn, who now stood before him, not as the terrifying creature of legend, but as a figure touched by sorrow and regret. "It is done," the Firstborn whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. Blaise's senses were sharper now, his vision clearer, and he could feel the pull of the night in his veins. He was no longer the warrior who had entered the tomb. He was something else, something more. Lilith and Sable stepped forward, their expressions unreadable, though there was a quiet reverence in their movements. "You have freed us," Lilith said, her voice soft, "but you have also bound yourself to our fate." Blaise stood, his limbs heavy with the newfound power coursing through him. The price had been paid, and there was no going back. Outside the tomb, dawn broke over the horizon. For the first time in centuries, the vampire clan emerged into the light of day, their faces turned toward the sun. The war was over, and with it, the centuries of bloodshed that had scarred both human and vampire alike. Blaise stood among them, the weight of his choice pressing down on him like a mantle of darkness. He was no longer human, but he had ended the war. That was his redemption and the price of peace. The Firstborn turned to Blaise, his eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. "You will rule now as I once did," he said, his voice soft but firm. You will lead our people into a new age, one where the curse no longer binds us, but where we still walk in shadow." Blaise nodded, the enormity of his task settling over him. He had saved them, but the road ahead would not be easy. He had become part of the night, and with that came the responsibility of guiding those who had once been his enemies. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Blaise took one last look at the tomb that had been both a prison and a sanctuary for so many years. He had found his redemption, but it had come at the ultimate cost, his humanity. Now he would walk the night as a ruler of the cursed, forever bound to the darkness, but no longer its prisoner. The war was over, but the battle for his soul had only just begun.